Chapter 20 of the surprising adventures of Bampfylde Moore Carew, King of the Beggars, by Bampfylde Moore Carew. This recording is in the public domain. Mr. Carew, having left Bristol, made the best of his way to Bridgewater, and from thence into Taunton, and so to Exeter, supporting his travelling expenses by his ingenuity as a mendicant. As soon as he arrived at Exeter, he made the best of his way to the house of an old acquaintance, where he expected to hear some news of his beloved wife, but going through Eastgate he was met by two gentlemen, who immediately cried out, "Here's our old friend Carew." Then they laid hold of him, and took him back to the Oxford Inn, where they inquired where he had been this long time. He acquainted them in what manner he had been seized on Topsham Quay, and carried to Maryland. He likewise informed of Captain Simmonds' death, which they were sorry to hear of, and that the vessel had been carried into port by Harrison the mate, who was afterwards drowned, in company with some planters in Talbot river. Fame having soon sounded the arrival of our hero through every street in Exeter, several gentlemen flocked to the Oxford Inn to visit him, and amongst the rest merchant Davy. "What, have you found your way home again?" said the merchant. Yes, yes, replied he. As you sent me over for your pleasure, I am come back for my own, which made the gentleman laugh very heartily. The merchant then asked him several questions about Captain Simmonds and Harrison, where he left the vessel, and if he had been sold. No, no, replied he, I took care to be out of the way before they had struck a bargain for me, and as to the vessel, I left her in Miles river. The gentleman could not help being surprised at his ingenuity and expedition in thus getting home twice before the vessel which carried him out. Merchant Davy then proposed making a collection for him, and began it himself with 1/2 crown. Having therefore received a handsome contribution, he returned the gentleman thanks, and took his leave, being impatient to hear some news about his wife. He went directly to his usual quarters at Kitty Finnamore's, Castle Lane, where he occasioned no little terror to his landlady, she believing it to be his ghost, as she heard he was certainly dead. However, our hero soon convinced her he was real flesh and blood. He then inquired when she heard from his wife, who informed him to his great joy that both his wife and daughter were there a few days before, and were going towards Newton Bushel, but they had given over all thoughts of seeing him any more, as they thought him dead. He now set forward immediately for Newton Bushel. Calling at Lord Clifford's in his way, he was told by Mrs. Ratcliffe the housekeeper, and Mr. Kilshaw the steward, who were quite surprised to see him, that his wife had been there just before, supposing him to be dead, and that he would find her at Newton Bushel. Though it was then night, our hero, impatient of seeing his wife and daughter, set forward for Newton Bushel, where he arrived late in the night. Going directly to his usual quarters, he found them all in bed, and calling out to the woman of the house, his wife, hearing his voice, immediately leaped out of bed, crying, it was her poor Bampfylde. A light was then struck with as much expedition as possible, and his wife, daughter, and landlady all came down to open the door to him. Here, how shall I find words to express the transports of our hero, the tender embraces of his wife, the endearing words of his daughter, and hearty congratulations of the landlady? Unable for the task, most gentle reader, I must imitate that celebrated painter who painted Agamemnon with a covering over his face, at the sacrifice of his daughter, and draw a veil over this scene of tenderness. Let it suffice to say, that their joy was too full to be contained, and not finding any other passage, gushed out in tears. The next morning, accompanied by his wife and daughter, he went and paid his respects to Sir Thomas Carew, at Hackham, where they were received with great kindness, and Sir Thomas told him, if he would forsake the mendicant order, he would take care to provide for him and his family. He returned Sir Thomas a great many thanks, but declared that, as he had entered himself into the mendicant order, he was resolved to continue therein as long as he lived, but hoped if any accident happened to him, he would extend his goodness to his dear wife and daughter. It was about this time that one of the greatest personages in the kingdom being at Bath, Mr. Carew was drawn thither with the rest of the world to see her, but to more advantage indeed to himself than most others reaped from it. for making himself as much an Hanoverian as he could in his dress, etc., he presented a petition to her as an unfortunate person of that country, and as every one is inclined to be kind to their own country folks, he had from her a very princely benefaction. Some time after this, Squire Morris, who succeeded to the fine seat and estate of Sir William Morris, near Launceston, in Cornwall, coming to reside there, and hearing much talk of Mr. Carew, was very desirous of seeing him; and he happening to come soon after into that neighbourhood, some of the servants, who knew their master's inclinations, chancing to see him, soon conducted him to the house, and showed him immediately into the parlour, where Mr. Morris was with a good deal of company. Mr. Carew was made very welcome, and the company had a great deal of conversation with him, during which Mr. Morris very nicely examined every feature in his countenance, and at last declared that he would lay any wager that he should know him again, come in what shape he would, so as not to be imposed upon by him. One of the company took Mr. Morris up, and a wager was laid that Mr. Carew should do it within such a limited time. This being agreed upon, Mr. Carew took his leave. He soon began to meditate in what shape he should be able to deceive the circumspection of Mr. Morris, and in a few days came to the house, and endeavoured in 2 or 3 different shapes, and with as many different tales, to obtain charity from Mr. Morris. But he, remembering his wager, would hearken to none. At last, understanding that Mr. Morris was to go out a hunting one morning with several of the company who were present when the wager was laid, he dressed himself like a neat old woman, and walking in the road where they were riding along, all of a sudden he fell down, and so well counterfeited all the distortion of the most violent fits in such a terrible manner, that Mr. Morris was greatly affected with the poor creature's condition, ordering his servants to get down and assist her, staying himself till she was brought a little to herself, then gave her a piece of money, and ordered one of his servants to show her his house, that she might have some refreshment there. But Mr. Carew, having obtained what he desired, flung off the old woman, and discovered himself to Mr. Morris and the rest of the company, wishing them all a good morrow, upon which he owned that he had fairly lost the wager. Mr. Carew some time after this steered his course for Oxford, where he visited Messrs. Treby, Stanford, Cook, and other collegians, his particular friends, of whom he got a trencher cap. Having stayed at Oxford as long as was agreeable to his inclinations, he set out for Abington, and from thence to Marlborough, having put on a pair of white stockings, a grey waistcoat, and the trencher cap. Thus equipped, he pretended to be disordered in his mind, and as his knowledge of the Latin tongue enabled him to intermix a few Latin phrases in his discourse, which he made very incoherent, he was in no fear of being discovered. Under this character he therefore went to the minister of Marlborough, who, seeing his dress, and finding he could talk Latin, made no doubt but he was an Oxford scholar whose brain was turned, either by too much study or some misfortune, and therefore talked to him a good deal, endeavouring to find out the cause, telling him that though he was unfortunate now, things might go better with him hereafter. But he could get nothing but incoherent answers from him. However, he gave him 1/2 crown. From hence he went to Market Lavington, where he likewise deceived the minister, and going forward to Warminster, he met with Dr. Squire and his brother the Archdeacon of Bath, who both took him for an Oxford scholar whose brain was turned, and relieved him as such. The next morning he went in the same dress to Mrs. Grove's at Wincanton, and from thence to the Reverend Mr. Burt's at Sutton, at both of which places he was much pitied and handsomely relieved. He then steered for Somerton, and visited the Reverend Mr. Dickinson, but this mask would not avail him here, for the parson discovered him through it, but he desired him to keep it secret till he was gone out of town, which he accordingly did. He therefore went boldly to the Reverend Mr. Keat, and pretended to be a scholar at Balliol College, which Mr. Keat believing, and pitying his condition, he gave him a crown. Next day he went to Bridgewater in the same habit, and from thence to Sir Charles Tint's at Haswell. Going into the court, he was met by the Reverend Mr. Standford, who immediately knew him, and accosted him with, "How do you do, friend Carew?" Soon after that came Sir Charles, who accosted him also in the same manner. Mr. Standford and he made themselves very merry at the character he had assumed. "Well," said Sir Charles, "we will make you drink, but unless you can deceive my Bess," so he was pleased to call his lady, "you shall have nothing of me, but whatever she gives, I'll double." He was then ordered into the hall, and exchanged his cap for a hat with one of the servants. After waiting some time, Lady Tint came down. It will here be proper to observe, that this lady, though of a very charitable disposition to her poor neighbours, having been often deceived by mendicants, and finding few of them deserving of her charity, had resolved to relieve no unknown objects, however plausible their tale. But our hero, depending upon his art, was not afraid to accept of Sir Charles' challenge. From the servants' hall he watched a proper opportunity of accosting the lady, and she passed and repassed several times before he could speak to her. At last, seeing her standing in the hall talking with Sir Charles, he came behind her, and accosted her with, "God bless you, most gracious lady." The lady turned about and asked him pretty hastily from whence he came. "I am a poor unfortunate man," replied he, "who was taken by two French privateers coming from Boston, and carried into Boulogne, where we were teased day and night to enter into the French service, but refused to do it." "And how got you from thence?" asked the lady. "We took an opportunity of breaking out of the prison, and seized upon a fishing boat in the harbour, with which we got safely to Lymington, being in all 25 of us, where we sold our boat." "What do you beg for then? If you sold your boat, you must have money." "Several of us were sick," replied he, "which was very expensive." "But what countryman are you?" "I am an old England man, please you, my lady, but I have my wife in Wales." "From what part?" says the lady, who was a native of Wales herself. "I married," replied he, "one Betty Larkey, who lived with Sir John Morgan, and afterwards with Parson Griffy at Swansea." "Ay, did you marry Betty Larkey? How many children have you by her?" "Only one daughter," replied he. In the meantime, Sir Charles and the parson were ready to burst with containing their laughter, to see how he managed my lady to bring her to; for his assertion of having married Betty Larkey, who was a countrywoman of my lady's, and formerly known to her, was a lodestone which presently drew my lady's hand to her purse. Then turning to Sir Charles, she asked him if he had any small money about him. "I have none," replied Sir Charles, pretty bluntly, being scarce able to contain himself from bursting out into laughter. So she went up stairs, and soon returning gave him 5 shillings, and asked him to eat and drink, going out herself to call the butler. In the meantime Sir Charles stepped nimbly into the servants' hall, and fetched the Oxford cap, which he put on Mr. Carew's head. The lady and butler came in immediately after, and she, seeing the cap upon his head, cried out, "God bless me, what did you bring that from France? It is just like one of our Oxford scholars' caps." "Ay, so it is indeed, my lady," replied Sir Charles. "Why, don't you know who it is? It is Bampfylde Moore Carew." "Ay, ay, this is your doings, Sir Charles," said the lady, and went away somewhat disgusted at the trick that had been put upon her. Sir Charles, however, was as good as his word in doubling the money his lady gave, and Parson Standford gave him 1/2 crown. Some time after this he called upon the Miss Hawkers of Thorn, near Yeovil, who treated him very hospitably, and inquired what news he had heard, it being in the late rebellion. Whilst he was talking with them, he observed a new house almost opposite, and inquired who lived there. They told him one Parson Marks, a dissenting clergyman; upon which, taking leave of the ladies, he stepped over the way, and knocked boldly at the door, which was opened by the parson himself. "Sir," said Mr. Carew, pulling off his cap, and accosting him with a demure countenance, "I have come 3 miles out of my road on purpose to call upon you. I believe, sir, you are acquainted with my brother, Mr. John Pike of Tiverton, teacher of a dissenting congregation of that place, and you have undoubtedly heard something of his brother Roger Pike." which unfortunate man I am, having been taken prisoner coming from Boston in New England by 2 French privateers, and carried into Boulogne, where we were cruelly treated. Alack, alack, said the parson, pray come in, good Mr. Roger. I am indeed very well acquainted with that worthy servant of God, your brother, Mr. John Pike, and a gracious man he is. I have likewise heard him mention his brother Roger. He then ordered some victuals and drink to be instantly brought out for good Roger Pike. While he was eating, he inquired how he got away from Boulogne. He replied that 25 of them had broken out of prison and seized upon a vessel in the harbour, by which they had got safe to the English coast. Well, said the parson, what news did you hear in France? It is reported there, replied he, that the rebels are very powerful in Scotland, and that great numbers are gone over to them safe from France. Stop a little, Roger, cried the parson, and running upstairs, soon after came down with a letter in his hand, which he read to him, wherein it was said that the rebels were very powerful. Then shaking his head very sorrowfully, cried, Indeed, Mr. Pike, I cannot be at ease, for they say they will make us examples on account of the 30th of January. Never fear them, sir, said Mr. Carew, we shall be a match for them in Devonshire and Cornwall. I am afraid not, cries the parson, shaking his head again. I have had no rest for thinking of them these several nights past. After some farther discourse, he fetched Mr. Pike a good Holland shirt, and clapped a half-guinea into his hand, entreating him to take a bed with him that night, for he should be heartily welcome. But he desired to be excused, and took his leave with many thanks, and returned to Miss Hawker's again. Well, Mr. Carew, cried the ladies, you have had a very long conference with the parson. Ay, ay, replied he, and to good purpose too, for this shirt and a half-guinea are the fruits of it, and then told them in what manner he had deceived the parson, which made them laugh very heartily. They then gave him 5 shillings, and promised to keep Mr. Pike's secret for a day or 2. A few days after, the parson going over to see the ladies, they asked him if a poor seaman had been at his house. Yes, replied the parson, it was one Roger Pike, whose brother had a congregation in Tiverton, and whom I am very well acquainted with. And did you give him any assistance? Yes, I gave him a shirt and a half-guinea. And we gave him 5 shillings, said the ladies, not as being Roger Pike, but as Mr. Bampfylde Moore Carew, at which the parson was in a very great hurry, and would scarce be convinced but that it was old Roger Pike. Thus had Mr. Carew the happy art of suiting his eloquence to every temper and every circumstance, for his being the brother of good Mr. Pike of Tiverton was as powerful a lodestone to attract the parson, as his marrying of Betty Larkey had been to Lady Tint. From hence he went to Parson White's at Cocker, where he found Justice Proctor. Here he passed for an unfortunate sailor who had been cast away coming from the Baltic, and was now travelling to his native place, Tintagel, in Cornwall. Parson White asked who was minister there. He replied that one Atkins was curate, and that there was no other there at that time. The justice asked but few questions, and told him he ought to have a pass, and asked where he landed. He replied, at Dover. Had you a pass then from the mayor there? We had one, said he, very readily, but some of our company being sick, and myself in good health, I left them the pass, and came forward by myself, they not being able to travel so fast. Why then, says the justice, you are liable to be taken up as a vagrant for begging without a pass. However, we will relieve you, and if you call upon gentlemen only, they will scarcely molest you. He returned them a great many thanks for this civility, and then went to a tanner's hard by, where he changed his story, and passed for a bankrupt tanner. Here he was likewise relieved, as he touched upon the right string, for had he passed here for an unfortunate sailor, probably his eloquence would have had no effect. From hence he went to the parson at East Chinook, and told him that he belonged to a man of war, in which his brother was lieutenant. Being then about dinner time, the parson asked if he could eat sea provisions, such as pork and peas. which he readily accepting of, they sat down together, and had a great deal of discourse about the lieutenant. Next he went to Madam Phillips in Montacute, where happened to be Parson Bower of Martock, who asked him if he knew Bampfylde Moore Carew. Sir, replied he, I am of Tintagel, in Cornwall, and know the Carews there very well, and have heard of the wanderer you speak of, who, I'm told, is a great dog stealer, but know not what has become of him, for some say he is hanged. God forbid he is hanged, cried the parson, upon account of his family, and after some other questions he was relieved with sixpence. Leaving Montacute, he went forward to Yeovil, having appointed to meet his wife and daughter at the sign of the Boot, Sherborne, and from Yeovil to Squire Hellier's at Lewiston, who treated him very handsomely, and would have had him stay there all night, but he excused himself, being impatient to see his wife and daughter. As soon as he came to Sherborne, he went to his usual quarters, the sign of the Boot, where he inquired for his wife and daughter. But how was he thunderstruck when he was told they were in hold at Webb's the bailiff! He inquired for what reason, and was informed that 4 officers had been walking all through the town to take up all strangers, such as chimney sweepers, tinkers, pedlars, and the like. What could our hero do? He revolved it over and over in his mind, and at last determined to go to Webb's, resolving either to free his wife and daughter, or else to share their fate. When he came there, he asked to see the prisoners, and demanded upon what account they had apprehended his wife, as she had neither stolen nor begged in the town. This occasioned high words, and at last ended in blows. Long did our hero maintain an unequal fight with great valour. At length, being overpowered with numbers, he fell, but not till his assailants had felt the force of his arms. He was kept in safe custody that night, and the next morning taken with the rest of the prisoners before Thomas Medlicott, Esquire, at Milbourne Port, where they were all examined, and all maintained their professions to be extremely useful. The chimney sweeper alleged he preserved houses from taking fire, whereby he saved whole towns, and consequently was a useful member to his country. The tinker harangued on the usefulness of kettles, brass pans, frying pans, etc., and of consequence what use he was of to the public, and our hero declared he was the famous Bampfylde Moore Carew, and had served his king and country both by land and sea. The justice thought proper to send these useful men to their respective parishes at the public expense. Accordingly, Mr. Carew and his wife and daughter were ordered to Bickley in Devonshire. The Sherborne people waited upon them to Yeovil, where they were delivered to the care of the chief magistrate. The next day, horses being provided, they set out for Thomas Proctor's, Esquire, at Cocker, but he refusing to sign the pass, they proceeded to Axminster, where the magistrate refused to receive them, on account of the pass not being signed, upon which they would have left Mr. Carew, but he insisted upon being accommodated to the end of his journey. They therefore adjourned to Mr. Tucker's, about 2 miles from Axminster, who asked him if he had a mind to have his attendants dismissed, or chose to have their company to Bickley, and he replying that he did not choose to have them dismissed, Mr. Tucker signed the warrant, and our hero, with his wife and daughter, rode all the way very triumphantly into Bickley, where as soon as they arrived, the bells were set a-ringing, and the greatest joy spread through all the place. End of chapter 20.